The boardroom on the 38th floor of the Caldwell Tower smelled like leather and old money, the kind of place where the heating worked too well and the silence was deliberate. Alec Drummond stood at the far end of a table that seated 12, though only 6 chairs were occupied, all on the opposite side, all belonging to members of the Vanthorpe family, who had built their forestry and energy empire across 3 generations and 4 provinces, and had never, in all that time, lost a negotiation they had chosen to enter. He was 37 years old. He had started his environmental technology company out of a rented basement suite in Waterloo with secondhand servers and a whiteboard he had found on the side of the road. He had built something slowly and without fanfare that the Vanthorpes now wanted badly enough to fly their entire inner circle to Toronto on a Tuesday. The man at the center of the table, Harrison Vanthorpe, 71, silver-haired and unhurried in the way only generational wealth allowed a person to be, leaned forward and slid a folder across the polished surface without looking up. $840 million, the family's legal counsel said, speaking before Alec could reach for the document. Full acquisition. Operational transition within 90 days. Your title remains ceremonially for 2 years. The number sat in the air. Alec opened the folder. He read carefully because he always read carefully, and because the language in the first 3 pages alone told him everything he needed to know before he reached the financial terms. The word ceremonially in the offer was not accidental. It was precise. It meant a desk, a title plate, a LinkedIn profile that still said founder, and no decision-making authority over anything that mattered. They were not buying his company. They were buying his name off it. Harrison Vanthorpe watched him, read the way a man watches a younger man figure something out, patient in the way of someone who has already decided the outcome and is simply waiting for the other party to accept it. "You've done something genuinely interesting," Harrison said, his voice even and generous in a way that managed to feel neither genuine nor generous. "Clean capture systems, carbon offset integration, the municipal contracts. Impressive for where you started." He paused, letting that last part settle. "But you're operating on borrowed runway, Alec. Men in your position usually understand when an offer like this is also a rescue." No one laughed. But across the table, Harrison's daughter, Margot Vanthorpe, 45, who managed the family's acquisition portfolio and had not smiled once since Alec walked in, tilted her head slightly in a way that communicated the same thing a laugh would have without requiring the effort. And that was when Alec felt it, not the sting of the comment, not the insult of men in your position, but something quieter and more corrosive. The specific humiliation of being evaluated in a room where no one expected you to evaluate back, of being looked at as a liability to be absorbed rather than a person to be negotiated with. He turned another page. His hand, without intention, drifted to his jacket pocket. His phone was there, and without fully deciding to, he pulled it out just enough to see the lock screen. Hazel, 6 years old, gap-toothed and squinting against the sun at her school's spring fair last May, holding up a paper crown she had made herself, the word "winner" written on it in purple marker in letters of varying sizes. He looked at that photo for 2 seconds, no longer. When he set the phone face down on the table and looked up, the room was the same. The Vanthorpes were the same. The folder was still open in front of him. But something in Alec had gone very still, the way things go still before they become immovable. He read to the end. He closed the folder. He set his hands flat on the table, and when he spoke, his voice was calm in a way that surprised even him. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but what you're describing isn't an acquisition. It's a substitution. You'd be replacing me with my own company and keeping the logo for continuity." He pushed the folder back across the table. "That's not something I'm willing to sell." Margot Vanthorpe's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted, the way a person's attention sharpens when they realize the conversation is going differently than the preparation had accounted for. Harrison studied him for a moment, fingers loosely clasped, his tone dropping from generous to something cooler. "You understand what turning this down means?" "I do," Alec said, and he stood. He gathered his jacket from the chair, picked up his phone, and walked toward the door with the specific kind of steadiness that is not performed, only arrived at, the kind that comes from having already made the decision before the room knew it was being made. The elevator ride down was 41 floors of silence. When the doors opened into the lobby, the city noise of downtown Toronto filtered through the glass entrance, taxis, streetcars, the particular kind of urban indifference that had always made the city feel honest to him. He pushed through the revolving door and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the October air cold and direct against his face. His phone buzzed, a notification from Hazel's school. A reminder about the parent-teacher interview he had rescheduled twice and promised, specifically and in writing on the kitchen calendar, that he would not reschedule again. He exhaled slowly. He put one foot in front of the other, He walked toward the subway. The apartment was on the second floor of a building on Ramses's that smelled, always, like someone was cooking something on the floor above, garlic or onions or both, and where the radiators knocked reliably at 9 p.m. in a way that Hazel had decided years ago was the building saying goodnight. Alec had never corrected this interpretation. He heard her before he opened the door. She was singing to herself, something tuneless and invented, the kind of song that existed only in the moment of its creation and would never be repeated again. When the lock clicked, the singing stopped. Dad. She came around the corner from the living room at a run in mismatched socks and a sweater that was 2 sizes too large because she had gone through a phase of wanting to wear his sweaters and he had let her keep one. She wrapped both arms around him at the waist and held on. He crouched down and held her back, and it was, as it always was, the most uncomplicated thing that happened to him in any given day. "Hey, bug." She pulled back and looked at his face with the directness that children have before they learn to be tactful about what they see. "You look like you did the time the car wouldn't start and we missed the ferry. That specific? Your eyebrows are doing the thing." He smoothed her hair back from her face. "Big day. I'm okay." She accepted this without pressing, which was one of the things about her that still quietly astonished him. She could read him with an accuracy that had nothing to do with being told things, and she knew somehow the difference between "I'm okay, don't worry," and "I'm okay, ask me later." This she had filed under the first category and moved on. "I made dinner," she announced. "You made dinner." "I put the pasta in." And I pressed the buttons on the microwave for the sauce. Remy helped. Remy was the stuffed rabbit she had carried everywhere since she was 2, which had lost one ear in the wash and whose remaining ear was loved into a soft, shapeless thing. Remy did not cook, but Hazel considered his presence a contribution. "That's basically made dinner," Alex said, and she grinned with the gap-toothed brightness of someone who had been waiting for that exact response. They ate at the kitchen table with the overhead light on because the bulb in the lamp in the corner had burned out, and Alec had not yet replaced it, which Hazel had logged as a complaint 3 days running, and which he had agreed each time was a valid point. The pasta was a little overcooked and the sauce was the jarred kind, and it was entirely fine. Hazel talked about her friend Rosalie from class who had gotten a hamster, and about the leaf-rubbing project, and about whether hamsters got cold in the winter or if they hibernated, which she thought might be the same as being cold but longer. "I think that's bears," Alex said. "Bears and hamsters have the same idea, though." He didn't argue with that. He washed the dishes. She sat on the counter beside the sink, which was not technically allowed, but which had been occurring with such regularity that enforcement had become theoretical. She handed him things to dry. "Dad, did the meeting go okay?" He rinsed a pot and thought about what version of true he could give her. "It was hard," he said. "Some meetings are hard. Did you win?" "I'm not sure yet." She kicked her feet against the cabinet gently, thinking, "Rosalie's dad has hard meetings too," she said. "She says he comes home and doesn't talk for a really long time. Does that bother her?" "A little." Hazel handed him the colander, but she says she knows he's still him. Alec looked at her for a second longer than was necessary for the task of drying a colander. "Yeah?" She says the hard meetings don't take the dad part out. They're just the outside. He set the colander on the drying rack and didn't say anything for a moment. "Rosalie sounds pretty smart," he said finally. "She is," Hazel agreed. "Her hamster is named Biscuit." He got her to bed at 8:30, later than intended, because there were 2 chapters left in the book they were reading together, a story about a lighthouse keeper and a sea creature who communicated through patterns of light, and stopping at the end of chapter 11 when chapter 12 was right there was, as Hazel pointed out accurately, not fair to the lighthouse keeper. He read both chapters. He turned off her light, stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her in the blue dimness. Remy tucked under one arm, her breathing already settling into sleep. He closed the door. And then he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and his phone, and the weight of what the next several weeks were going to look like. And it was all considerably worse than he had let himself feel while she was still awake. By 11 o'clock, the notifications had accumulated into something that could only be called a pattern. 3 partners pushing back timelines without explanation. An email from the provincial grant office flagging a review process that had been routine for 2 years. A supplier he had worked with since the beginning suddenly unable to confirm the Q1 shipment. Each thing individually might have been coincidence. Together they were a message. The Vanthorpes had not waited until morning. Alec did not sleep well. He woke at 5:40 with the particular clarity of someone whose mind had kept working without him and made coffee and sat with it in the gray early light of the kitchen while the upstairs neighbor's cat walked across their floor, in the way cats walk across floors in old buildings, loud, deliberate, unconcerned. His inbox had 14 new messages. His CFO, Brooke, had sent 3 of them, timestamped between midnight and 2 a.m., which meant she had also not slept. The third message said simply, "Call me when you can. It's moving fast." He called her at 6. "Tell me it's not what it looks like," she said instead of hello. "I don't think I can," he said. The silence on the line was the kind that people make when they have been hoping to be surprised and haven't been. "Alec." Her voice was measured the way it always was, even under pressure, which was one of the reasons he had hired her. "They're hitting every soft point. I've had 4 calls since yesterday. People who have never even asked about payment terms suddenly have questions about our liability structure. That is not organic." "No," he agreed. "You understand what they're doing." "Yes. Then tell me we have something." He looked at the coffee in his mug, at the kitchen calendar on the wall, at the grid of October squares with their handwritten notes. Hazel's dentist appointment. His accountant, parent-teacher night, circled twice in red. "Give me 72 hours, he said. "Alec, I know what I'm asking. 72 hours, and then if I don't have a different conversation to offer you, we'll talk about everything else." Another silence. Then, carefully, "What aren't you telling me?" "Something I've been sitting on," he said, "because I didn't think I'd need it yet." The meeting with his team that morning was the hardest thing he had done in recent memory, and he had, 2 years prior, spent 4 months managing a class action from a municipality that had tried to walk back a signed contract so the bar was not low. They gathered in the small conference room that doubled as a storage space for the office's promotional materials, foldable banners with the company logo leaning against the wall in a way that now felt faintly absurd given the conversation they were having. 9 people around a table meant for 8. His operations lead, a careful man named Gideon Parrish, who had joined the company from a federal environmental agency, and had never once in 4 years raised his voice, raised it now, just slightly. "You're telling me we walked away from $840 million. I'm telling you I turned down a deal that would have ended the company as we built it," Alec said. "Those are different things." "They're not that different from where I'm sitting," said Brooke, who had arrived in person rather than by phone, which told him how seriously she was taking this. "I understand that." He didn't look away. "I understand that I made a decision that affects every person in this room without asking any of you. I know what that means, and I'm not asking you to tell me it's fine." "It's not fine," said Brooke. Evenly, not unkindly. "I know." He looked at all of them in turn. "What I'm asking is for 72 hours to show you why I made it, because I did not walk away because of pride. I walked away because accepting those terms would have handed them the ability to dismantle every safeguard we built into the platform. The land monitoring, the indigenous partnership protocols, the offset verification system, all of it becomes negotiable the second they own our voting structure." Gideon leaned back in his chair. "And in the meantime, they're calling every contact we have. Yes, which means by Thursday we may not have a company left to protect." "I know," Alec said again. 72 hours. The room was quiet for a long moment. It was Brooke who broke it, not with agreement, but with the particular kind of restraint that meant she was choosing to extend trust she wasn't certain she had grounds for. 72 hours, she said. He nodded once. He left the conference room and did not let himself think about anything except the next step, because there was no version of the next 72 hours that had room in it for anything he couldn't act on. There were 3 calls he had not made yet. He made them over the following 2 days, from his car, from a corner booth in a coffee shop on Queen Street, and once late at night, sitting in the parking lot of Hazel's school after picking her up early from an after-school program so they could get groceries together and she could argue in favor of the cereal that was mostly marshmallows. He had not released the full scope of the platform publicly. Not because it wasn't ready. It had been ready for 8 months. He had sat on it because releasing something into the wrong, structural hands at the wrong moment was, in his industry, the same as not having built it at all. What Vantorp Capital had seen was the foundation. The municipal contracts, the capture systems, the carbon ledger. What they hadn't seen was what the platform could do at scale with the federal habitat datasets he had been quietly integrating for the better part of 2 years. A predictive modeling system that could map ecological tipping points with a resolution and lead time nothing else on the market came close to. 3 research institutions had evaluated it in confidence. 2 of them had asked in writing if there was a path to licensing it. He had said, not yet, now it was yet. By the time 72 hours had passed, 2 of the 3 calls had resulted in conversations he could bring to the table. Not finalized, not signed, but real enough. The second meeting with the Vanthorpe family was not in the Caldwell Tower. It was, at Alec's request, in a smaller room, a boardroom in his own building, which was modest by comparison, the kind of space where the chairs didn't all match and the whiteboard still had ghost marks from a previous session. He had not cleaned it up. He had thought about it and decided against it. Harrison Vanthorpe arrived with Margot and 2 lawyers, which was fewer people than the first meeting, and told Alec something about how the dynamic had shifted, even if no one had said so outright. Alec did not wait for the other side to begin. He set a slim document on the table and slid it forward. It was not the 80-page folder the Vanthorpes had brought to the Caldwell Tower. It was 11 pages. "You came to us," he said, "because you understood that clean techland monitoring is going to be a regulatory requirement in 4 provinces within 18 months. You wanted our contracts and our client list and our team. What you didn't know, because I hadn't shown anyone, is what the platform actually does." He let them read. He watched Harrison's expression as he turned through the pages, the kind of reading that starts measured and then slows down in a specific way when something on the page doesn't match the document you expected to be reading. Margot reached the 3rd page and stopped. She looked up. "This is the federal habitat layer. Yes, you have access to the full data set. We built the integration," he said, "over 18 months. We're the only private entity with a licensing agreement to run predictive modeling on the complete data set. That's not public." "No," Alec said. "It isn't." Harrison set the document down slowly. The room had changed in a way that was not dramatic or sudden, but was unmistakable, the specific shift that happens when the person who assumed they were acquiring something realizes what they were actually standing in front of. "What do you want?" Margot said. It was not quite a question. It was the beginning of a different kind of conversation. "What I wanted when I came to your building," Alec said. "A partnership, not a purchase. I keep operational control. I keep my team's structure intact. Your family's capital backs the scaling, and you get a meaningful stake and a seat at the table as an investor, not as an owner." Harrison studied him. There was something in his expression now that had not been there in the first meeting. Not warmth, not yet, but the recalibration of a man who, as real as the numbers he was working from, were incomplete. "You held this back deliberately," Harrison said. "I built it deliberately," Alec said. "What I held back was the choice about when to show it." A pause. Then Harrison Vanthorpe looked at his daughter, and she looked at him, and the exchange lasted only a moment, but it contained something that had not been in any of their previous interactions, an acknowledgement that they had miscalculated. "We'll need to review the federal agreement," Margot said. "Of course," Alec said, "and the 3 research institution evaluations. I'll have them to your council by end of day." The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. No one raised their voice, no one made an offer that night. But when it ended and the Vanthorpes filed toward the door, Harrison paused at the threshold, turned back, and looked at Alec with an expression that had shed its earlier condescension so entirely that it was almost worth remarking on. "You should have led with this," he said. Alec held his gaze. "You should have asked what you were buying. A beat." Harrison nodded once, slowly, and walked out. Alec sat in the empty boardroom for a few minutes after the door closed. He didn't immediately reach for his phone. He looked at the ghost marks on the whiteboard and the mismatched chairs and the evening light coming through the windows at a low angle, long and orange, across the table. Then he gathered his things and left. Hazel was at the kitchen table when he got home, her homework spread out in front of her, a worksheet about the water cycle that she had half completed and then apparently abandoned in favor of drawing a very detailed whale in the margin. "That's a good whale," he said, hanging up his jacket. "It's a beluga," she said, with the precision of someone who considered this distinction important. "They live in the St. Lawrence." "I knew that," he said, which was only partly true. She looked up at him with the face-reading focus that had become, over the years, one of the most quietly humbling things about being her father. She looked at him for 2 full seconds. "You're different," she said. "Different how?" She considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. "Like when a test is over," she said. "Not happy exactly, just like the test is over." He sat down across from her and looked at the beluga and the half-finished water cycle. "Yeah," he said, "a little bit like that." She nodded and picked up her pencil and added a small detail to the whale's fin. "Dad, yeah, I didn't finish my worksheet. I can see that. The whale was important." "Belugas usually are," he said, and she grinned and turned back to the evaporation diagram with renewed commitment, as though the whale had been a necessary step in getting there. He made tea. She finished her homework. The radiator knocked at 9, right on schedule, and Hazel looked up at the ceiling and said goodnight back in a tone of perfect normalcy, and Alec sat with his mug at the kitchen table and felt something settle in his chest that he didn't have a precise word for. Not relief exactly, not victory. something quieter and more durable than either of those things. He thought about the room on the 38th floor. The leather and the deliberate silence and the folder slid across a polished table by a lawyer who didn't look up. He thought about the number hanging in the air, 840 million, and what it was actually attached to. He thought about how he had almost not looked at his phone. The deal that came together over the following 6 weeks was not the one the Vanthorpes had brought to the table in the Caldwell Tower. It was smaller in certain ways and larger in others, structured as a strategic investment rather than an acquisition, with terms that Brooke reviewed and re-reviewed and finally described in a single-word email as workable, which from Brooke was approximately equivalent to enthusiasm. The platform launched its scaled version in February. By March, 2 of the remaining provinces had cited it in their updated regulatory frameworks. The federal monitoring team, who had been aware of the integration from the beginning, released a joint statement that Alec read 3 times before allowing himself to believe it was real. His name appeared in a profile in the Globe and Mail, which described him as a quietly disruptive figure in Canadian environmental tech, and quoted him once, a sentence he had actually said and that he was glad to stand behind. The question was never whether the technology could do more. The question was whether we could keep it pointed at the right things. He had not framed the article. Hazel, however, had asked him to cut it out and had taped it to the wall beside her bed next to a drawing she had done of the 2 of them, stick figures under a large sun, his stick figure substantially taller and inexplicably wearing a cape. "You gave me a cape," he said. "You always look like you should have one," she said with complete sincerity. He didn't say anything to that. He looked at the drawing on the wall for a moment, at the 2 figures under the lopsided sun, and felt something that was too simple to be called an emotion, but was somehow larger than most of the things he had felt in boardrooms. On a Saturday in late March, they drove out to Crawford Lake, because Hazel had been reading about the Anthropocene marker found in its sediments, which her teacher had mentioned in passing, and which had opened a 40-minute dinner conversation about what it meant that scientists could read time in layers of mud, and she wanted to see the lake itself in the way she wanted to see most things she had read about to verify that they were real. It was cold and bright. The trail through the trees was still iced at the edges and the shadows. Hazel wore the orange toque she had knit herself over the winter in a lopsided spiral that was technically a hat, and she walked ahead of him on the path with Remy tucked under her arm, because Remy came to places that mattered. When they reached the water, she stood at the edge of the boardwalk and looked out at the lake for a long time without speaking. He stood beside her. "It doesn't look different," she said finally. "No, but it knows things." He thought about that. "I think that's right." She looked up at him, then back at the water. "Like you," she said, "you know things. You just don't always say them until you need to." He didn't know what to say to that, so he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood there for a while longer in the cold brightness, looking at a lake that carried the record of an entire era in its depths. Quiet and steady and not going anywhere. He had not walked away from $840 million. He had walked toward this, toward the lake and the lopsided toque and the rabbit with one ear, toward the kid who drew whales in the margins of her homework and read the news of the world with the seriousness it deserved and still found room, always, to say goodnight to a radiator. That was the thing no one had understood in that room on the 38th floor. That the company had never been the point. It had always been the way of doing right by something larger than himself, the land, the work, the small particular person who believed, without irony or qualification, that her father should have a cape. And standing there at the edge of that ancient lake with the morning light on the water and her shoulder warm against his arm, Alec Drummond understood, with the kind of certainty that does not require defense or announcement, that he had not made the hardest decision of his life in that boardroom. He had made it years before in a hospital room, holding a newborn who was too small and too loud and absolutely certain of him, and every decision since had only been an extension of that one. He held his daughter a little closer. The lake held its silence the way it always had, and the morning kept going, ordinary and irreplaceable, exactly as it should.